Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, October 14th, 2020. A little challenging, the process of putting today's podcast together. There's a whole lot of news, trying to sift through the hearings of Amy Covid Barrett at the United States Senate are keeping your humble host extremely busy. But I want to begin today with analysis of two crimes and bad police behavior. And what we have seen is the incredible overreach of police officers all across this country. And item one today is a CBS interview with Kenneth Walker. He is best known as Breonna Taylor's boyfriend. And his account of what happened last March when he and Breonna were in their bedroom watching TV, when the cops arrived and broke down the door, is really stunning. It's chilling. And it shows the deep contempt that many members of law enforcement have for law and order. So it is quite a story, and I want to share this with you as he told Gayle King. He said that the officers who searched the apartment after Breonna had been shot did not appear to try to save Taylor as she lay on the floor. And he did not find out she was dead until he heard it on TV while he was locked up because he had fired his weapon, which was legally registered. And he didn't know that it was cops who were breaking into their apartment. He said the pair had been watching a movie in bed when the cops raided the apartment as part of a narcotics investigation. He said, to the world, she's a hashtag, a picture, and all of that, but to me it was much more. More than a girlfriend, too. I think that's what I want the world to know the most. That was my best friend, the most important person, pretty much to me on earth. And they took her. Neither Walker nor Taylor had criminal histories. No illegal drugs were found at the scene. The cops had been investigating Taylor's ex-boyfriend, who didn't live at her address. And on the night of March 13th, they entered the apartment using a so-called no-knock warrant. And Walker said it was a normal day. You know, we went on a date. We went out to eat. Then he heard a loud bang at the door, receiving no response when he called out asking who was there. I'm 1,000,000% sure that nobody identified themselves, he said. If they had knocked on the door and say who it was, we could hear them. It was dead silent. Feeling deathly afraid, Walker said that he and Breonna scrambled to put on some clothes to make themselves decent to answer the door. And then I grabbed my gun, he said. A licensed gun owner with a concealed carry permit. He said this was the one time he had to use it. He said if they had known it was the police, they would have just opened the door to them. And then the door was flown off its hinges. Thinking this was a home invasion, Walker fired a single shot. Then police returned fire. Walker said he had never heard so many gunshots at the same time. Quote, I've never been to war, but I assume that's what war probably sounds like. He had been holding Breonna's hand during the gunfire when he heard her scream. I pulled her down to the ground, but, she was scared, so she just didn't get down. When the shot stopped, Walker said Taylor was alive and bleeding. He first called his mother as he held Breonna. I told Mom that somebody just kicked in the door and shot Breonna. And she's freaking out at this point, but she told me to call 911, so I did. The gut-wrenching call has since been made public. An operator asked Walker if his girlfriend is conscious. He says, no, she is not. Bree, oh my God. And he told Gayle King, that if he knew it was the police, he would not have called the police for help. That doesn't even make sense, he said. So he hung up on 911, then he called Taylor's mother. When he realized the police were at the door, he thought they had responded to his call and come to help him. Walker went to them only to face guns drawn and threats of dogs. And get this is so cruel, cold, and callous. He said one of the officers asked him if Walker had been hit with any bullets, and he said no. And the cop replied, "That's unfortunate." Wow. Cocky son of a bitch. And this, to me, epitomizes the arrogance of law enforcement. They had just killed an innocent person. And he had the ugly presence of mind to drop that sarcastic comment. Walker said at that point they pulled him out of the apartment, dragged him down the street barefoot to a squad car on gravel, rocks, and everything. He said he still has injuries on his feet. And a short time later, a plainclothes officer told Walker there had been a miscommunication. Walker was initially charged with attempted murder of a police officer, but never told him directly that Taylor was killed. He said, "I was in the cell and it was like on the news, and they said one female dead." And that's when he knew that it was Breonna. So that's just one shocking episode. That's from March of this year. Then we had George Floyd. We had protests all summer long. Some of those protests continue to this day in Portland, Oregon. And as you know, back in late August, a lefty who claimed allegiance to the idea of Antifa, his name is Michael Reinoehl, he was on the streets of Portland, and he encountered, I believe it was a Proud Boys member, and they had an altercation, and Reinoehl shot and killed the right-wing protester. And then he hit the road, and he was holed up about 120 miles north of Portland in southern Washington state. And on September 3rd, U.S. Marshals who knew where he was and had been surveilling the apartment where he was staying with a friend noticed that Reinoehl had left the apartment and was heading into his Volkswagen station wagon parked on the street. And at that point, U.S. Marshals converged. They had two SUVs. And according to 21 eyewitnesses, and this is an excellent investigation by the New York Times, I often have criticism for the Times, but this is very well done. Now, Bill Barr, Mr. Law and Order, trumpeted this operation as a significant accomplishment that removed a violent agitator. And Barr represented that his U.S. Marshals opened fire when Reinoehl attempted to escape arrest, and he produced a firearm during the encounter. But if you believe the New York Times, Bill Barr is bullshitting. In interviews with 22 people who were near the scene, all but one said they did not hear officers identify themselves or give any commands before opening fire. That's too eerily similar to what I just described in the Breonna Taylor killing. And the cops apparently didn't rehearse their cover story because they gave different accounts about whether or not Reinoehl had a weapon. One said to investigators he thought he saw Reinoehl raise a gun inside the vehicle before the firing began, but two others said they didn't. Reinoehl did have a handgun, a .380 caliber, that was in his pocket. But it was still in his pocket when he was declared dead on the street. There was also an assault-style rifle that was wrapped up in a bag in his car, and it was untouched. So here's one eyewitness, Garrett Lewis, who watched the shooting begin while trying to get his 8-year-old son out of the line of fire. Said the officers arrived with such speed and violence he initially assumed they were drug dealers gunning down a foe. until he saw their law enforcement vests. Quote, I respect cops to the utmost, but things were definitely in no way, shape, or form done properly. The Marshals Service has declined to comment to the New York Times, citing the pending investigation. It previously said it had attempted to peacefully arrest Reinoehl and that he had threatened the lives of law enforcement officers. And Trump, of course, inappropriately intervening in so many of these cases over the last almost 4 years. He told Fox News, this guy was a violent criminal, and the U.S. Marshals killed him. And I'll tell you something, that's the way it has to be. There has to be retribution when you have a crime like this. So the retribution is justified because the man who died in Portland was a Trump supporter. No trial is needed. They did not even have a warrant for the arrest of Reinoehl when they executed him. So, and let me correct myself. The man who died in Portland and Reinoehl is accused of shooting him is Aaron Danielson, and he's a member of Patriot Prayer. My apologies to the Proud Boys. So Reinoehl claimed that he had shot in self-defense. That was an interview conducted just before he was located and killed by this U.S. Marshal task force. And the account, according to the Times, is that Reinoehl left the apartment, walked toward his VW, parked along the street 100 feet away. 2 officers positively identified Reinoehl, who proceeded to get into the car. They decided to make an immediate arrest, the officers told investigators, in part to avoid a high-speed chase. And I will remind you, they did not have a warrant. This is vigilantism under the color of law. So an eyewitness named Smith said that he and his friends turned their heads, they'd been working on a car nearby, to the sound of a vehicle accelerating rapidly, headed southbound toward the street where Reinoehl was walking. A second SUV, which had been parked across from Smith's house, moved in with such speed that the friends thought they were witnessing a road rage incident or a gang shooting. Another eyewitness, Nate Dingus, lived in the apartment, so apparently he was hosting Reinoehl. And he said Reinoehl was chewing a gummy worm as he approached his station wagon with a phone in one hand and a bag in the other. And Dingus said that officers began jumping out of the vehicles before they had come to a complete stop. One of them opened fire immediately, before any commands could have been given. Another man who was walking his dog nearby said that a burst of about 10 gunshots began almost immediately after the SUVs came to a halt. He did not recall hearing any commands. And another witness named last name Lewis was on the other side of the scene, 140 feet, also said the police opened fire immediately without giving any warnings. There was no get out of the car, there was no stop, there was no nothing. They just got out of the car and started shooting. There was no yelling, there was no screaming, there was no altercation. It was just straight to gunshots, said another eyewitness. So this was an execution. And as I say, the process was abrogated in order to produce a dead body for Donald Trump so that he could brag about his version of law and order. But the law applies to law enforcement as well, and equally. And in this country, way too many people have lost sight of that. I've linked to the New York Times report, as well as a Guardian report about Kenneth Walker's details of the killing of Breonna Taylor, and I invite you to click on the links and read the articles. I think you'll find it fascinating and equally alarming. Now, this does not rise to the same level because what I'm about to tell you are 3 cases of protesters in Portland who have sued the police department. Now, they're still alive. But they have sued because of excessive force, inhumane use of tear gas, unlawful dispersal orders, and other violations of civil rights. Here's one case. Erica Christensen says she was watching an August 9th protest from the sidewalk next to her friend's house, and this is about 10:30 p.m., and she told the police to leave. A police officer responded by pushing the 28-year-old to the ground and shooting her 5 times at point-blank range with plastic buckshots. So her crime? She had a big mouth and she used it. And it cost her $5,000 in medical bills, injuries to her chest, groin, and hip area. And her lawyer, Jason Kafuri, said his client wasn't able to identify the officer, hasn't heard from the police bureau as to why she was shot, and the officer did not detain or arrest her. Case number 2, Cale Josephs claims a violation of his free speech rights and false arrest. He was taken into custody back on June 8th at about 12:30 a.m. He was with his boyfriend. They'd participated in a protest at the County Justice Center when 3 officers suddenly sped up to them in their cars. Josephs was holding a sign that read accountability and transparency, and the officers told the pair they were violating curfew, even though there was no curfew in effect that night. Josephs apparently gave the cops some lip about their qualified immunity. The surveillance video shows Josephs pointing twice at the officers and speaking in an animated way. They suddenly bolt toward him, prompting him to run. They caught up to him, where they arrested him but not his boyfriend. No charges were filed in that case. And the third involves Amanda Lundbaum, who was known to the police at these protests because she would show up and hand out food and water. Well, when she pulled up to one of the protests, the cops knew who she was, and they told her she was parked illegally. She said, "Well, no, I'm not. Look at the sign." And police then said, "We're towing your car because it's more than 12 inches from the curb." So she tried to retrieve a ticket that a cop had placed under the windshield wiper. They wouldn't let her. She also wasn't given a receipt when they towed her SUV. And now 2 weeks later, she still hasn't been able to get her car back, and it contains her wallet and house keys. And these are fairly recent events. I mean, one is from June. But the police have been under scrutiny for their over-response. This was even before the goon squad that Trump controls arrived in Portland. The June incident was. And so there is a widespread problem of police who do not operate within the law. And with that as a little introduction, let's take a look at Amy Coney Barrett's record on the appeals court in Chicago in cases related to the police. In a case of Torrey et al. Versus City of Chicago, she concluded that officers were reasonable in stopping and harassing a group of black men, even though there was absolutely no evidence that they had committed a crime. In Biegert versus Molitor, Barrett sided with police who shot a mentally ill man to death after his mother had called 911 for assistance. In U.S. versus Wilson, Barrett concurred with the decision that officers had reasonable suspicion to use force to detain a black man when he ran away from them because he had a bulge in his pocket, and it was a high-crime area. And she said, a reasonable officer could infer from Wilson's flight that he knew he was in violation of the law. This is scary. And shifting to other topics on immigration, she's indicated she would defer to the executive branch's absurd reasons for denying visas to lawful immigrants without requiring the Trump administration to justify its decisions. Now, those cases and comments come from opinion columnist Nathan Robinson at The Guardian. And I've been following his commentaries. I think he's pretty solid. Later, he says, the fact that Barrett may be qualified doesn't automatically entitle her to a Supreme Court seat, and her politics are enough to justify trying to keep her off it. But I'll remind you that the last time that U.S. senators stood up to a nominee who was qualified but extreme in his political views and rejected his quest for confirmation was in the matter of Robert Bork. That goes back to the, let's see, Bork was the Solicitor General who approved Nixon's firing of the Attorney General. The firing of the special counsel after the Attorney General refused, and it was Reagan who tried to nominate Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. And I once interviewed Bob Bork, and he was a very disarming right-wing extremist. So here's some different notes culled from reporting on the confirmation hearings. This is the last day of the questioning of Judge Barrett. Tomorrow will be a pro forma session where witnesses who support her or oppose her will be permitted to speak, but it's a done deal. We haven't seen anything surface that would deny her confirmation, because that would take the conscience of at least two members, Republican members, of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that has not occurred. So Lindsey Graham, who's in that tight Senate race with African-American Jamie Harrison, who keeps asking me for money, even though he's got $58 million, and that's just in the last quarter. Anyway, Graham made a comment today that he said was heavy sarcasm. And it was related to the reticence of Judge Barrett to comment on almost any cases, except those that are so settled that nobody expects them ever to come back before the court. So she was quizzed about Brown versus the Board of Education. And Lindsey Graham said, "One of the reasons you can say with confidence that you think Brown versus Board of Education is super precedent is that you're not aware of any effort to go back to the good old days of segregation by a legislative body. Is that correct?" And Barrett responded in the affirmative. And Jamie Harrison's campaign said that Lindsey Graham is way out of touch. His spokesman said, even as peaceful protesters demonstrate across our state for equality and justice, Graham can't help but refer fondly to a time of violent oppression and segregation against African Americans. It's 2020, not 1920. Act like it, said Harrison. Graham, on the defensive, said, "The point I'm trying to make is that there's nobody in the legislative arena wanting to take us back to that dark time in American history. I want to make sure everyone in my state moves forward. In terms of that statement, it blows my mind that anyone can believe that about me." Really, Lindsey? What did he say the other day, that it's okay to be black in South Carolina as long as you're conservative? I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to that effect. Judge Barrett said that it's shockingly unlikely that any state or federal lawmakers would try to reinstate bans on birth control. That is the Griswold case. Came in response to a question by Chris Coons of Delaware, who contrasted her record with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Barrett said the 1965 case striking down a ban on contraception, "I think Griswold is not going anywhere unless you plan to pass a law prohibiting couples, all people, from using birth control." Well, that's a relief. But, of course, only Republicans can talk to her and get any kind of response when it comes to abortion rights. And so Lindsey Graham said, "This is the first time in American history that we've nominated a woman who's unashamedly pro-life and embraces her faith without apology. And it'll be a great signal to all young women who want to share your view of the world, and there's a seat at the table for them." But when Democrats tried to talk about abortion issues, she dodged the question and we shifted from the confirmation dance yesterday to Dodge 'em, the theme park ride. When the elderly Pat Leahy of Vermont asked Barrett whether a president could refuse to comply with a court order, she said, well, yes, the Supreme Court can't control what the president does. Can the president pardon himself, she was asked. So far as I know, that question has never been litigated. That question may or may not arise, but it's one that calls for legal analysis about what the scope of the pardon power is. Kamala Harris set the stage for tough questioning of Judge Barrett, and she began by describing the importance to her of the Affordable Care Act. And then, speaking to Barrett, she said, prior to your nomination, were you aware of President Trump's statement committing to nominate judges who will strike down the Affordable Care Act? I'd appreciate a yes or no answer. And she didn't comply. Barrett said, I don't recall hearing about or seeing such statements. Now, I know Notre Dame and South Bend, Indiana, are in their own world, their own bubble. But heck, Mayor Pete came from there. And I think they have TVs and everything. And she's not aware that Trump said he would only nominate judges who would kill the Affordable Care Act? Well, that really doesn't hold up to any kind of close scrutiny. And while she's been on the Seventh Circuit in Chicago, she's considered 3 laws restricting abortion and expressed misgivings about rulings that had struck down the laws. She joined the dissent against a decision to strike down an Indiana abortion rule signed into law by Mike Pence that mandated the fetal remains be buried or cremated, which I just think is really sick. And in declining to detail her views, she did go out of her way to say, I have not made any commitments or deals or anything like that. I'm not here on a mission to destroy the Affordable Care Act. I'm just here to apply the laws and adhere to the rule of law. But Democrats dismiss those assurances as essentially meaningless. Trump didn't need to secure any specific promises from Barrett, they argue, because he selected her precisely because her honestly held legal views would achieve the end that he sought. And, of course, she was vetted by the Federalist Society, who made sure that Trump would only consider justices or candidates who match his agenda. I want to take a moment here to talk further about abortion issues because Senator Gary Peters, who's kind of a milquetoast Democrat from the state of Michigan, he surprised a lot of people by sharing an extremely personal story in the context of this Supreme Court nominee. He said back in the 1980s in Detroit, Peters and his then wife, named Heidi, were pregnant with their second child. And she was 4 months along when her water broke, leaving the fetus without amniotic fluid, a condition it could not possibly survive. But their doctor was practicing at a Catholic hospital. And so, after Heidi went to see this doctor, he said, well, we're not allowed to perform abortions here. Why don't you go home and see if you just have a miscarriage? And they waited. And Heidi's health deteriorated. 3 days later, she returned, and the doctor told her the situation was dire. She could lose her uterus in a matter of hours if she wasn't able to have an abortion. And if she became septic from the uterine infection, she could die. And so the doctor appealed to the hospital's board for an exception to their anti-abortion policy, and he was denied. Senator Peters said, I remember that answering machine message from the doctor, quote, they refused to give me permission, not based on good medical practice, simply based on politics. I recommend you immediately find another physician who can do this procedure quickly. They were able to do so, and the mother survived. And I want to take a moment to share with you a speech that was delivered on the House floor by a woman I occasionally disagree with, but I highly admire. She is a congresswoman from just south of San Francisco, Jackie Speer. And she told her own story. Listen.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I had really planned to speak about something else, but the gentleman from New Jersey has just put my stomach in knots. Because I'm one of those women he spoke about just now. I had a procedure at 17 weeks, pregnant with a child that had moved from the vagina into the cervix. And that procedure that you just talked about was a procedure that I endured. I lost a baby. But for you to stand on this floor and to suggest, as you have, that somehow this is a procedure that is either welcomed or done cavalierly or done without any thought is preposterous. To think that we are here tonight debating this issue when the American people, if they are listening, are scratching their heads and wondering, what does this have to do with me getting a job? What does this have to do with reducing the deficit? And the answer is nothing at all. There is a vendetta against Planned Parenthood, and it was played out in this room tonight. Planned Parenthood has a right to operate. Planned Parenthood has a right to provide services for family planning. Planned Parenthood has a right to offer abortions. Last time you checked, abortions were legal in this country. Now, you may not like Planned Parenthood. So be it. There's many on our side of the aisle that don't like Halliburton. And Halliburton is responsible for extortion, for bribery, for 10 cases of misconduct in the federal database, for a $7 billion sole source contract. But do you see us over here filing amendments to wipe out funding for Halliburton? No, because
that's a pretty unusual comparison. Jackie Speer gave that speech on the floor of the House in February of 2011. Other angles on the Barrett nomination, she told the senators today that she's heard about climate change, she's read about it, but, she's no expert. She said she had no firm views on the existence and threat. I've read about climate change. I'm certainly not a scientist. I mean, I've read things on climate change. I would not say I have firm views. But David Sirota and his colleagues are exposing that her father, Michael Reinoehl, was an attorney for the Shell Oil Company. And, of course, back in the 1980s, Shell, based on its internal science reports, knew about climate change. And it's interesting because in her Senate questionnaire, Sirota reports that Barrett produced a list of cases and parties that she would recuse herself from. That list includes Shell. So that's a very interesting disclosure, because she has dodged the question about whether she would recuse on the Affordable Care Act, on issues related to the presidential election, claiming that she would have to see what situation arises. But I find that quite interesting. And just a sidebar about climate change, a new study showing that the deep blue sea is warming along with the surface. Over the last 10 years, the water at a depth of 4,400 feet has warmed by as much as 0.04 degrees centigrade. That may seem minor, but it is significant. Quote, if you think about how large the deep ocean is, it's an enormous amount of heat. That's Christopher Minan, oceanographer at the U.S. at NOAA, and a lead author of this study published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters. Roughly 90% of the heat absorbed by the Earth goes into the oceans. Although they warm slowly, the heat makes water molecules expand, and that contributes to sea level rise. And as a non-scientist, I find that informative because I thought it was simply the sea level rise was driven by the melting Arctic ice and glaciers. But the molecular impact makes sense to a non-scientist like me. Back to Coney Barrett. An analysis from Robin Given, published in the Washington Post today, notes that Trump is hovering above this hearing. And even though she says she's made no deals, no commitments, didn't discuss any particular issues with Trump, Senator Durbin of Illinois said in his opening statement, your nomination comes under a cloud. And, quoting Givens a little bit more, this hearing is not normal. The nomination smelled. Barrett had to explain to the committee that she'd made no commitment to the White House about how she would rule on Trump's pet subjects. She had made no illicit bargain in exchange for the nomination, she said. She's not there to impose her personal will or Trump's on the court. I'll follow the law, she said. And she described herself as all about process, collegial conversation, and digging into the details of disputes. All that sounds good, but will you commit to recusal from any disputes arising from the presidential election? Asked Senator Coons. She said, I will consider all factors that are relevant to that question. So she's very well rehearsed. She comes off as knowledgeable. She didn't use any notes, no documents or a computer screen on the table in front of her. And it is a remarkable extemporaneous performance on her part. And over at the New Yorker, John Cassidy comments. His headline reads, the Amy Coney Barrett Supreme Court hearings are an enlightening sham. And he picked up the term sham from A.B. Klobuchar's opening comments. And as far as enlightening, he said, well, the nominees point-blank refused to say anything about the most consequential cases they are likely to be called upon to decide. And the senators resort to giving political speeches. And that is the predictable pattern here in these kind of confirmation hearings. And he continues, Barrett's performance, the main point of interest was her performance and whether she'd be able to maintain the convenient fiction that if elevated to the Supreme Court, she'll behave like a baseball umpire, calling balls and strikes without any regard to her personal feelings. And Cassidy says, despite her evasiveness, her Democratic interlocutors did highlight some of the prior associations and expressions of belief that she was so keen to downplay. Pat Leahy got her to acknowledge that she signed on to that Right to Life letter back in 2006 and forgot to submit it to the committee. Leahy also quizzed her about a lecture she gave to the Blackstone Legal Fellowship, a Christian program run by ultra-conservative organization called Alliance Defending Freedom. Leahy asked, are you aware that the ADF's decades-long efforts are to recriminalize homosexuality? And Barrett said, I'm not aware of those efforts. No. And I take her at her word there. But you would think when you spend all of your time in the conservative pool that you know who the other swimmers are. And Ryan Grimm has some of the strongest commentary. He says a single dominant theme has emerged from the hearings. Barrett said she is a textualist who believes in the plain meaning of a statute. And he said she's lying. The lie was exposed in her assessment of the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Senator Feinstein of California had asked her about Shelby versus Holder, where John Roberts wrote the opinion and said that, we don't have racism anymore. We fixed that. Barrett was asked by Feinstein if she agreed with her old pal, Justice Scalia's conclusion that the act was a perpetuation of racial entitlement. Barrett declined to answer, instead repeatedly framing the case as one in which the Supreme Court decided whether the law's key provision was outdated and needed to be updated from the 1960s. And the reason that Ryan Grimm considers her a liar is that she overlooked that the Congress renewed the Voting Rights Act in a bipartisan vote in 2006. And despite calling herself a textualist and an originalist, Grimm says her response to Feinstein is precisely the type of thing that the legal movement Barrett comes out of crusades against. It's not up to judges, originalists, and textualists to say, it's not up to judges, they say, to put a finger in the wind and rewrite laws. That's the job of lawmakers. And he says that discrepancy alone marks a stark contradiction between her stated approach and her actual approach to the law. But it's worse than that, and that's where he references the renewal in 2006. The existing Supreme Court, with 8 seats filled, yesterday rejected and overturned a lower court decision that was made in San Jose by a pretty bright woman named Lucy Coe. She's been on the federal bench for a while now. And she had said that the census, the 2020 census, should run its course through the end of October. And it's been a matter of back and forth where in April the Trump administration said they needed extra time. And then suddenly they decided they didn't need extra time. And we know, for example, in Los Angeles that they have undercounted so far based on a comparison to the 2010 census. And so with only Sotomayor in a dissent, and that doesn't mean that Kagan and Breyer agreed with this. They may have just allowed her to speak for them, and they knew that they were not going to prevail in a 5-3 situation. Sotomayor wrote, "Meeting the deadline at the expense of the accuracy of the census is not a cost worth paying. The harms caused by rushing this year's census count are irreparable," Sotomayor continued, "and respondents will suffer their lasting impact for at least the next 10 years. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Really nice people like Aidan McAleer, the incredible Faith Peoples, Benny Alto, and Nancy Kilgore. I really appreciate their support, and it's not too late for you to chip in a few bucks. All you got to do is visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. So I've been over this many times, that Facebook says it's not a publisher. It's just an aggregator. And they do that to duck responsibility and the technical legal issues related to being a common carrier or a publisher. And publishers have obligations. So the non-publisher has decided to use the discretion of a publisher. Facebook and Twitter have said they'll be limiting the distribution of a New York Post story making what are called unverified claims about Joe Biden. The New York Post published a series of stories it claimed were sourced from a hard drive given to it by a computer repair technician in Delaware that contained details of Hunter Biden's alleged business relationships in Ukraine. Now, this seems quite newsworthy to me. And if these can be verified as documents that were made or held by Hunter Biden, I believe they deserve to be published and not censored by Facebook or Twitter. So Twitter, which also claims it's not a publisher, is simply refusing to allow any posts about this. Facebook is using a more underhanded method. They are simply making sure that nobody sees it. They control the algorithms that decide what goes into your news feed. They said that they're going to diminish its distribution until it can be reviewed by a third-party fact-checker. And even BuzzFeed, which is covering this censorship story, refers to the claims about Hunter Biden and his work in Ukraine as flimsy. Well, flimsy is a real dismissive term, and this is editorialization in a news column. And I think that pursuit of what Hunter Biden did is at minimum a conflict of interest and incestuous behavior by the son of a sitting vice president. Is it flimsy? Well, how can we know if we're not permitted to evaluate the documents that have just been released? I want to recommend a report that was published yesterday at consortiumnews.com, and it updates a story that we covered about 6 months ago, and I did a podcast interview with the editor at Consortium News, Joe Laria. And this is a case where a Canadian global news TV network smeared Consortium News, saying that a report that it published was part of an attack, a cyber influence campaign directed by Russia against a Canadian politician. And this relates to Chrystia Freeland, who is now a deputy prime minister in Canada. And when the founding editor at Consortium News, the late Robert Perry, published a report exposing that Chrystia Freeland had lied in a biography about her grandfather's history. The grandfather was a Nazi sympathizer who was involved in their propaganda efforts in Ukraine and in Poland. So Joe Laria defended his media platform and the history of Robert Perry, his legacy, and they have now sued Global News in a court in Virginia. Global News did publish a slight modification. It was an editor's note that referred to claims made by Consortium News that it's not directed by Russia, and something to the effect of Consortium News says that it is an independent outlet. There's a lot more to the story. I've linked to the lengthy report at Consortium News. I encourage you to check it out, and I've asked Joe Laria for an updated interview so we can bring you more about this unusual case. Well, this has to be really deflating for Trump, and he alluded to it at one of his mob rallies on Monday night. His effort to expose what he called Obamagate and what he believes are the corrupt origins of the Russiagate investigation. And as you know, despite everything I feel about Donald Trump, I think that he happens to I don't say he's always right, but some of his allegations, I believe, can be substantiated. So one of the things that his consigliere, Bill Barr, whose day job is to run the Justice Department, the rest of the time he's on duty as Trump's lawyer, Barr assigned U.S. Attorney John Bash to look at the unmasking. Now, this gets a little complicated, but in the final days of the Obama administration during January of 17, there was a report that was published that leaked the information that Mike Flynn, the incoming National Security Advisor, had had inappropriate phone conversations with the Russian ambassador. Those calls were intercepted, and Mike Flynn should have expected that. He had been a spook running the Defense Intelligence Agency under Obama. He got fired from that job. So this investigation, we're told, has not produced any fruit. There is no claim that there will be a report or any charges surfacing. And there was the, what can we call it, a perception created that at a White House meeting in early January where Joe Biden was present, Obama was present, FBI Director Comey was there, John Brennan from the CIA, that they discussed the unmasked information about Flynn's phone calls. And at least the appearance was there of a potential conspiracy to use that information to damage Trump by damaging Mike Flynn. Well, that one is hit a dead end. And honestly, I'm a little surprised by that. I thought Trump would be able to maneuver some sort of product before the election. Jason Leopold, who does his best reporting under the Freedom of Information Act, writes at BuzzFeed today that he followed up on Trump's claims by Twitter that he had fully authorized the total declassification of all documents related to the Russia investigation. But when Leopold and BuzzFeed pressed the issue, the Justice Department told a court that the president's tweets are not dispositive. The Justice Department conferred with the White House, and Bradley Weinsheimer, Associate Deputy Attorney General, said in a declaration for the court, the Justice Department was informed that Trump's tweets do not require altering any redactions on any record, and that his tweets are ambiguous, do not refer to any specific document, and do not indicate that the president was exercising his constitutional authority to declassify specific information. Well, that's a dead end, a cul-de-sac that Trump created for himself. And Trump, late last night, in an apparent payback for Joe Biden's comments yesterday, where he said that Trump has neglected older Americans and that seniors, he said, you're expendable, you're forgettable, you're virtually nobody. That's how he sees seniors. The only senior that Donald Trump cares about, the only senior, is Donald Trump. So Trump's retaliation was to tweet out a Photoshop photo of Biden in a wheelchair inside what appears to be a nursing home, mocking him as elderly and disabled. I've tried to warn you, when it comes to Trump's behavior, we have not hit bottom. And the Washington Post is publishing a report based on a purloined video that they got of meetings organized by the Council for National Policy, a group that is a hub for the nationwide network of conservative activists, and the notable members are the wife of Clarence Thomas, Ginny Thomas, and Leonard Leo, who was running the Federalist Society. And I encourage you to read this piece at the Post, and I believe I have included a link to it. Let's see. Well, I will. And it's important because Sheldon Whitehouse, the senator from Rhode Island, used his entire speaking time at the Barrett hearing yesterday to give a damaging connect-the-dots review of the right-wing organizations that are funding both the selection of Amy Coney Barrett and the promotion of her nomination to the tune of $35 or $40 million in right-wing dark money. And so this group, Council for National Policy, is in the loop with those other groups, and this meeting has a lot of damaging commentary from people. They talk about ballot harvesting. That's what the California GOP is trying to do by placing their own collection boxes in various communities. Ralph Reed, ever a hypocrite, said our organization, he runs the Faith and Freedom Coalition now, he said our organization is going to be harvesting ballots in churches. We're going to be specifically going in not only to white evangelical churches, but into Hispanic and Asian churches and collecting those ballots. A former Justice Department official, president of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, J. Christian Adams, described mail-in voting as the number one left-wing agenda. Be not afraid of the accusations that you're a voter suppressor, that you're a racist, and so forth. So this is pretty damaging. It shows not only their contempt for voters, their determination to manipulate and suppress the vote, but their deep and wrongly held views in support of Donald Trump. Word is that Obama will finally head out on the campaign trail to support Joe Biden. And I think this is a little late. I mean, what do I have here? 14 million Americans have already voted. And Obama, who's not, I've got a lot of criticisms of what he did as president. He's a much better human being than Donald Trump ever can be. But he should have been out there already. So apparently that's going to be happening in the very near future. And along with the 14 million votes that have been cast, lots of problems. Long lines continue in Georgia and in Texas. Georgia has seen the delivery of 750,000 ballots so far. In Pennsylvania, a judge over the weekend denied an effort by the Trump campaign to make ballot drop boxes unconstitutional. Jesus. This is just so disgusting. Over at Mid-Press News today, Raul Diego's story is about developments in the Philippines, where under cover of creating a new and consolidated identification system that they say is primarily to simplify banking in the Philippines, well, this new identification card system would also include the COVID status of the person carrying that card. And I've heard some reasonable and some hysterical concerns about the pandemic being used to expand authoritarian power. And I think it's opportunism. I don't think it's the motive for the pandemic or its handling. But there's legislation for a new national ID here in the United States. The Improving Digital Identity Act of 2020. And the Democrats in the HEROES Act had, but I think they eventually deleted, a clause where the payments to individuals, the $1,200 payments, were going to be distributed on a new kind of debit card that could ultimately replace paper currency. But that didn't go into motion. Facebook and YouTube this time, have announced decisions. Facebook is going to ban ads that discourage people from getting vaccinated. This is a departure from their previous policy, which prohibited ads with vaccine misinformation, but allowed ads expressing opposition to vaccines as long as they didn't contain false claims. Well, almost daily now, we see Facebook limiting speech. And I believe there is a valid discussion about the safety of vaccines that are being rushed into syringes to be jammed into people's arms. We don't know the safety. We don't know the efficacy. And while clinical trials are underway at this point, we don't know significant potential side effects. So this move is echoed by YouTube. With this announcement, a COVID-19 vaccine may be imminent. Therefore, we're ensuring we have the right policies in place to be able to remove misinformation from the platform. Any content that includes claims about COVID-19 vaccinations that contradict expert consensus from local health authorities or the World Health Organization will be removed from YouTube. Even while I have my criticism of some of the extremists and indeed crackpots who are out there with skeptical or contrarian views about the pandemic, about the pharmaceutical industry, about the safety and efficacy of a vaccine, I staunchly support the rights of individuals and groups to express and to expound on their opinions. And this is ugly censorship Pure and simple. Here's today's COVID-19 update prepared by Linda Lewis. Global death tally related to COVID is now at 1.09 million. The U.S. death is at 216,000, and we reported over 800 new deaths across the country yesterday. The French government today declared a public health state of emergency, giving officials greater powers to impose new measures to contain the spread of COVID. French health authorities reported that the number of people being treated in hospital went above the 9,100 threshold for the first time since June 25th. Now, I hear some of my contrarians saying, well, this is still a case-demic. But with this increase in hospitalizations, we have to be concerned that death rates may increase too. So here's another report related to Europe. New cases are hitting about 100,000 a day, and Europe has overtaken the United States by a wide margin. We're at about the 50,000 per day level. The UK, France, Russia, and Spain accounted for more than half of Europe's new cases in the week of October 11th. But they still say that deaths are trending downward, and here in the United States have averaged about 700 a day over the last week, even as the case reports continue. 22 states across the United States have set records for new cases. Most European governments eased lockdowns over the summer, and they are now reinstating various iterations. Bars and pubs have been ordered shut down in Britain. Prime Minister Boris Johnson faces opposition calls for another national lockdown in England, but so far he is resisting. Hospital admissions in Britain are climbing, and field hospitals are once again being readied. The Washington Post reports on what is called the Great Barrington Declaration. And essentially, it's a call to allow the virus to run its course until humanity develops herd immunity. But that could cost a lot more lives because to achieve that, the estimate is that 2 to 3% of the infected population will die. So the Great Barrington Declaration, named after the town in Massachusetts where it was introduced on October 4th, came from a libertarian think tank, the American Institute for Economic Research. And the authors contend that permitting the virus to spread naturally among young people who are much less likely than their elders to have a severe outcome will shorten the pandemic by hastening the arrival of herd immunity. The declaration says the most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of reaching herd immunity is to allow those who are at minimal risk to live their lives normally to build up immunity through natural infection while better protecting those who are at highest risk. Now, one of the problems here is the so-called experts say that this represents a fringe group of the medical and scientific community, 2 to 3%, and that some of the signatures on the Great Barrington Declaration include names like Dr. Person Fake Name, Dr. Johnny Bananas, etc. And Linda Lewis has some comments. She says, the declaration is about everyone, the healthy and the vulnerable, being free to make personal risk assessments, given local information and personal circumstances they face. Every individual needs to consider their own health, the balance between their risk appetite and their desire to maintain normalcy in their lives, and the costs of isolation. She continues, people may be free to make their own assessment, but being able to reduce one's risk will depend largely on whether people are wealthy or not. It's nice to be able to consider one's health, but actually protecting it depends on access to health care, sick days, a robust medical system, and many other factors that constrain workers from staying healthy, while the wealthy have concierge health care and the comfortable isolation of yachts and huge estates. The idea that people who are struggling to work amidst a pandemic would not also experience physical, mental, and economic impacts is absurd. We've seen in recent weeks how the negligence of a few people quickly translates into a major outbreak that affects people far removed from the source. So I think that is an interesting angle. Linda also pointed out that in yesterday's COVID report, I gave you comments on a new film that is now available online, but I failed to give you the title of it. It's called Totally Under Control, and that, of course, is a soundbite from Trump, who has said that on many occasions. And this is the one that was produced by Alex Gibney, and it is available on Hulu, and it will soon be available on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, Fandango Now, Google Play, and YouTube. When I last referred to Dr. Anthony Fauci, he was bristling at the selective use of a misleading soundbite from him in a Trump campaign commercial. So it's a little surprising that he has resurfaced and says that he was asked and he has agreed to review the medical records that the White House has prepared about Trump's COVID status. So on Tuesday, Fauci and Dr. Clifford Lane from the National Institutes of Health assessed Trump's rapid recovery, and they looked at a PCR test. They also looked at results from attempts to grow live virus from Trump's samples. And Fauci said, "We were just given the data, and we made a determination. Quote, we feel confident that we can say with a high degree of confidence that Trump is not transmissible." Okay, this seems awfully miraculous to me. Steve Mnuchin says that talks for a pandemic relief package before the election are dead. We'll see. And people really need the money. That is for sure. And I hope that some sort of agreement can be reached before the election. Two more before I go today. Kevin Gostola has a great report based on a whistleblower who used to work in Greeley, Colorado at the JBS meatpacking plant. And this person was assigned to examine, with a thermometer and a quick couple of questions, whether employees were well enough to work. And the company stopped paying at some point for the COVID-19 tests of its employees. A manager indicated to the whistleblower that even if the sick employee declined a test, that they should be cleared for work. And Sarah Jean Buck declared, "I am not going to sign anything approving someone to go into work when they are clearly sick. That is not right, and I will not do that, so I quit." And there is more to that story. Also, as I close, I want to mention that the PBS NewsHour had an excellent report on the cover-up by Amazon of the lousy safety record of its workers in the huge warehouses that are the fulfillment centers when you place an order. And yesterday I didn't buy anything on the special Prime Day that they announced, but the report indicates that on Prime Days and Black Friday, the injuries spike, that in places where robots have been introduced, that injury rates go up, and that Amazon has tried to get its injured employees not to go to a medical facility where that injury will be reported to OSHA, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Instead, they want to send them to private clinics where there's a wink and a nod agreement that people will be given minimal treatment, sent back to work, and no damaging report or data collection will occur. So this is a powerful report, and PBS aired it, but we got to give credit for the Center for Investigative Journalism and their project called Reveal, where you can find the details of their investigation. Thanks for joining me all the way to the end. For today's News and Comment podcast, you're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I am Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy Happy trails